So basically, we can think a lot of the things that we came up with in Western music, such as scales and whatnot, may be derived in part, at least, from this pattern. Basic concept. When you play a note, say on a string or in a tube, so stringed instruments versus tube instruments, say wind instruments, right? You don't hear just one frequency, you hear the fundamental, meaning the big frequency, the one that we use to name the frequency, but that's the lowest pitch, a series of overtones. So that lowest pitch, like in music, when you hear that driving bass beat, the lowest note, right, is going to be the one that's really driving home in whatever sound is happening. That's the biggest wave when you drop the rock into the puddle or put the string to a task. But you have other tones that are coming off it as well, a series of overtones, which are higher frequencies. These overtones are called harmonics. So each overtone is a whole number, a multiple of the fundamental frequency. So that's kind of interesting. I don't want to get too in the weeds on the math on it, but I just want to point out here that there's variation because it's a whole number multiple, meaning it's not like a fraction multiple typically, right? It's a whole number multiple, but there's still variations that you can imagine that you would see happening. So that means that if you're trying to recreate something, then it's not like you have an infinite amount of variation of the overtone. There's some predictability. So if you were trying to create like an AI simulation of a guitar string, then you can imagine what would you have to do? Well, you would have the fundamental. That's pretty easy to tie down. But then you have to layer on top of it the simulation of all the other ripples. How would you do that? Well, it's not like there's an infinite number of them because there's some restriction to the way the pattern's going to work generally, right? So let's look at it here. So a series of numbers and frequencies. So here's the harmonic, the first, the second, the third harmonics that we're talking about. Here's the ratio 1 to 1, 2 to 1. So they're whole number ratios, 3 to 1. Notice this one approximate, so not perfect all the time, possibly. Then the musical intervals. Now we haven't dived in a lot to the musical intervals yet, but these are just kind of distances you can imagine. And we typically, when we get to our music theory stuff, are going to measure those differences and give them a name, the unison being the same note, so we haven't traveled anywhere. And then an octave, usually 12 notes up, right? That's going to be when it repeats. The perfect fifth is going to be one that's going to be in most of the scales, except for like the Locrian with the modes, the double octave, and then the major third, and then the major third. So notice when we have, say, a scale, let's imagine it's a C major scale. Remember, one of the things that we generally just accept when learning to play an instrument is the formula that is applied to pick certain notes out of the 12 notes in the musical alphabet to create a scale, which we're actually going to be playing within. In future presentations, we'll talk a lot about applying the formula to create different scales and how we can compare those different scales, how they're related, and how they can be useful for actually playing things. However, at this point, we want to get a general idea of the question that will typically come up if a music instructor says, hey, look, we're just going to apply this formula out. And that's going to be, well, where did you come up with the formula? Noting that sometimes it's useful to just simply accept things a priori. If the music teacher says, hey, this is the formula that we use because that's what they came up with, we've been using it forever, it works great, then we're going to say, great, let's just learn from there and we're going to be moving forward from that point. But just because we're going to move forward and accept that, even if we believe that that's true based on tradition, doesn't stop us from wanting at some point possibly to ask the question, why was that the way it is? And even if we don't think it's going to change our opinion, looking into it can give us a better understanding about certain things that could give us some musical ideas on how we want to apply our music and go on our musical journey going forward. So at this point, I just want to give a little bit of insight on the things that might have gone into basically generating the formula. The other thing I think is really useful here also is that particularly where I am at, sometimes people are kind of down on Western culture and they have this cultural relativism kind of thing. And so if that's the case for you, you're going to tend to say possibly, well, that must have been just a cultural kind of thing of Western culture, and I should be able to play any notes that I want to play and so on and so forth. And you can play any notes you want to play. But I just want to, if we see that this formula came about of something that's not specifically or completely out of a cultural context that might be useful to some people to understand, meaning if this is coming from something that naturally occurs in nature, it's not simply a cultural thing at that point, it's a human thing because all of our ears are picking up and tending to like similar kind of frequencies. So if that is the case, then it's an interesting project to look at different cultures and see if there's going to be similarities in the way music was constructed in different areas because of the similarities in our human experience, of sound would be the general idea. Now, you would expect some cultures, I think, have like pentatonic scales might be more common, meaning 5-note scales than a 7-note scale, for example. But even in Western music, we often play like 5 out of the 7 notes, and then we have the 7 notes added on. So, but I would assume that there's going to be similarities in different cultures because of something like this in terms of how the notes were created. However, there's 2 things that I think you might want to keep at least in the back of your mind that have a practical component as well to why we might have constructed the chords this way. One is that you've got your 12 notes. We know that those are going to be in linear fashion. They keep on going up forever. We also imagine them in a spiral as the octaves basically go up. If you pick any note, then you would expect that you're going to play something next to it. Usually you're going to play one that's going to skip a note. Why would skipping a note be the default thing to do? Because if you skip a note, it's going to sound like it's a stair step up. It's going up, but it's not too far that it sounds completely unrelated, and it's not too close that it sounds too muddy. That's going to be the general, like, intuitive thing that you would think, right? So whatever note I'm on, I'm going to skip every other note. Why? Because that's going to give me a nice stepping stone. It leads in, but it's not too close. Now, of course, we have 2 instances in our formula where there's these 2 notes right next to each other. That happens here, and when we go around back up to the top. So one reason you might expect that to be the case is because you want some variance. So if I'm taking all these steps, you would expect that you'd have mostly whole steps and a couple half steps maybe so that everything is not exactly uniform. That's one just kind of intuitive idea that you might come up with, which you can also see over here in a circular fashion. If I'm on C, you've got the whole step, the whole step, the half step, the whole step, the whole step, and then the half step. So the other thing that we would see is, maybe there's something with the harmonics that's going to be an idea of why it comes up. Now, to understand this a little bit more in depth, we need to understand the intervals. So we'll talk more about intervals later, but just to get a general idea, the intervals are just a measuring tool for how far away a note is. So if I go from this C to this E, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 steps away. So I'm going to name that interval by relative position, which is one of the things we're having issues with because that kind of forces us to think in a certain way. But if we're in the key of C, then you can see this is the 3rd note in our key, but it's actually 4 steps away if I looked at the 12 notes in our system. So we call that a major third. If it was only 3 notes away, it would be a minor third. So in essence, all we're doing is we're taking every distance that is possible and we're giving it a name based on the relative position of the scale. And so that's what these are going to be. So if we looked at the major scale, our intervals are traditionally based on the major scale. Let's try to look at what happens in this natural occurring harmonic. So remember, I like to imagine a rock dropped into a pond. You've got one big wave that's going to be the main tone, similar to sound waves, and then you've got the other ripples. So those other ripples are multiples of whole numbers. So the unison is the one big wave, and then you've got an octave. So it has an octave. So that makes sense because now that would be like a bar chord, right? On a guitar where you have multiple repeating notes on it. So okay, that's fine. And then you've got a 5th. Now the 5th is kind of interesting. Because if you look at our formula over here, the 5th is what we usually think of as like the stable note. Power chords, which are common in like rock and roll, are going to have the 5th. Now it's kind of interesting because it's not only in the C major that you have a fifth, but if you look at all the other modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, all of the normal modes have a perfect fifth in it. So that's so it's a stable sound. So you would expect that would be included. I would think, I haven't looked at every other culture's, basically musical, how their music is put together, but you would expect there'd be a fifth a lot of times because it's so stable sounding in scales that would come up in different cultures. The only one that it's not in is the Locrian, which has a flat fifth, which is the weird mode. That's why it's weird, because it has a flat fifth and all the rest of them do not. There's an augmented fourth here, so there is that same, but it also has a fifth in it. So, but we'll get into that later. And then we have the double octave, so another octave. So now you've got these ripples that are repeating. The big ripple has the same octave as another little ripple and another little ripple. And then it has a major third. Now that's what you would kind of expect in Western music from a Western music standpoint, because of course the third is going to be the distance in a major scale from this note to this third note, which is actually a distance of 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. So the third position is 4 notes away. It's a 4-note away major third is what I would call it. It not only happens in the Ionian mode, but when you play on other roots, the Lydian and the Mixolydian, which is the 1, 4, 5, the 3 major modes that you could build chords from, also have a major third in it. But then something interesting happens that this one has a minor third. So that's weird. The Harmonics series isn't just geared towards the major scale, because the defining factor between the major and the minor is the third. So now it also has a minor third to it, which is interesting because these set of notes that we came up with actually come up with 4 more of them actually have minor thirds than the major thirds, meaning the major minor scale, which is Aeolian, and the Dorian and the Phrygian all have minor thirds. Meaning, if you counted from the A and you went from the A to the third, which would be a C, from here to here, it actually has a distance of 1, 2, 3, as opposed to a distance of 4 notes. So that means and the Locrian has a minor third. So there's actually more minor thirds when you look at it from a modal standpoint than there are major thirds. Although the major third is kind of the main one kind of. So then this one's funny too, because you've got a seventh here. And the seventh is a flat seventh, which once again isn't typically in the major scale. So you might say, well, that's weird. Why would the seventh be the one? Why wouldn't it be a major seventh, not a minor seventh? Because the major seventh is what would be on the major, and it's saying it's a flat seven. But it's kind of interesting because notice that only the Ionian and the Lydian have a major 7. The rest of them, when you're playing in Dorian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian, all have flat 7s, right? So it's kind of funny that this series actually lines up to some extent more to the Mixolydian mode, you would think, right? Because it has a mixture of the major and minor, which is what we see in the blues oftentimes, and it has a flat 7. So that's kind of interesting. So I think that's kind of why the folksy music, I think historically there was a folksy kind of thing that was happening, which was mainly Mixolydian, that people liked the jamming in, the rhythm of and whatnot. And then we got into like the major scale because it's more storytelling based, right? It's more, it gives you more of a feel of the is directional possibly instead of just jamming kind of feel, I think possibly is the thing. And now, of course, we've kind of returned to some degree to a little bit of both, right? We've got this. So, but in any case, so it's interesting that between the major and Mixolydian, you would think that those would be the things that would kind of pop up in different cultures because those are because there's a reason that's human based, not cultural based, based on how sound works as to why you would think the culture would come up with things. All right, that's my general breakdown of it.